So turn number 18, January 45, has been completed. And things still lean heavily in the favor of the Axis. The game will continue into turn number 19. I rolled a 6, I believe, for the variable die roll ending. And Paris and Moscow are under occupation, so that added 2 to the die roll, but it was still only a 1 through 2 to end the war, and then the 2 capitals be under occupation. Only still bumped it up to a 4. So the war will continue, but with each passing turn, it becomes more likely that the die roll will end the game. So some countries taking a little bit more chances right now, kind of maybe doing some things that probably aren't going to work out. And if there was a guarantee the game was going to go long term, then there are probably things they wouldn't do. But again, with the Axis so far ahead, the Allies and the Comintern just kind of trying to play catch up and maybe do a few more things, a little more riskier options. So in Europe, Germany again is spending all of their money in Western Europe. So neither the United States and the British over here outside of Paris, nor the Germans in Paris themselves, neither one attacked the other. They're both kind of building up, although the Germans have by far the easier time building up units. So in Paris, that's a stack of upwards of 20 medium armor, about a dozen mechs, about 15 fighters, and 3 artillery. So there's no way the Allies are going to be able to punch through that. The Germans will actually probably attack this Allied territory here in France on this next turn. The Allies have about 10 British infantry, about 8 U.S. infantry, about a dozen U.S. medium armor, 3 British fighters, about 5 U.S. fighters, U.S. medium bomber, and about 3 U.S. Tactical bombers. So think the Germans are going to go ahead and move in this turn and completely eject the Allies from the continent again. And they still have a bunch coming from Germany. In West Germany, they built another 5 fighters. They've got about 15 infantry, about a dozen or so mechs, maybe even closer to 20 of each, and then 8 more medium armor behind in Bavaria. So there's pretty much no way the Allies are going to be able to get through Paris, let alone everything that Germany has back in Germany itself. Not to mention that the Germans are collecting right now, minus bonuses, $99. And then with bonuses and the income roll, you're talking about $115, $20 a turn. So Germany's secure, got things pretty much locked up in Western Europe. Over in the Soviet Union, or what's left of it, the Germans continue to push further and further east. They now have every territory that has any IPP value, minus a couple the British took, which we'll talk about in a second. Everything else is under German control. The Germans are now just 2 territories away from Novosibirsk, the new Russian capital. Now, they don't have a lot coming that way, but they have a couple of light armor, a couple cavalry, and about 5 medium armor, and then a couple of medium armor up here outside of a couple of territories outside of Moscow. So all that will move up a couple more territories. So they'll be right at the doorstep of Novosibirsk this next turn. The Italians are also coming up with just a couple of units, more of a nuisance than any kind of real threat. So the Russians have had to put everything into defending Novosibirsk. They sent out a couple of mechs as blockers. And then in Novosibirsk itself, they've got a couple of mechs, a couple of medium armor, a heavy armor, a fighter, and about 8 infantry. So I'm not sure Germany's going to actually be able to take Novosibirsk. All they have is minor factories around the Moscow area. So those can each produce 2 units per turn because of the improved factory tech the Germans have. But even still, if they wanted to produce ground units, that's going to take several turns to get to Novosibirsk once they produce them anyway. So Germany could go for air units, which might be the way they go starting this next turn going forward. As far as the British, they had a little fleet up here in northern Russia, So they landed in a couple of Russian territories, gave those back, obviously, to the Soviet Union. So the British landed all together with about a dozen infantry, and they got a nice fleet over here, a couple of heavy cruisers, light cruisers, 5 destroyers, and a light carrier. But the Germans already responded. They moved a couple of medium armor up, and they've got about 8 fighters in Leningrad. So obviously these infantry only attack at a 2, so they're not going to do almost any kind of damage whatsoever. And it's more of a nuisance to Germany, diverting a little bit of their attention to recapturing these northern Russian territories. The British aren't going to be able to hold them. But that was kind of the, thought the Allies had is, where were these guys going to go? They could have landed in the southern French territory outside of Paris to beef up those defenses, but I'm not sure another 10 guys would have really mattered. And like I said, Germany is easily winning the arms race to build up units in Paris and Western Germany. So the British decided to land over here, again, draw a little bit of a German attention away, give a couple territories back to the Russians who are hurting for money anyways, but the British aren't going to be able to stay there. But kind of desperate measures at this point for the Allies. Besides that, the United States came over, brought some transports, some destroyers, and they landed in this northern Spanish territory. So they took that. That was worth $1. And now they're in a position with those 5 medium armor and those 5 infantry to reclaim most of Spain back from the Italians on this next turn. The U.S. spent all their money in the Pacific this turn. As far as the Italians go, they went ahead and started building a fleet back up. So outside of Rome, they finished off a fleet carrier and 2 battleships. They also purchased another transport and 2 destroyers. So they've got the makings of a decent fleet again in the Mediterranean. They also took Portugal from the British and then moved up into Madrid. But again, with the U.S. landing on their portion of the turn, the U.S. has got enough to eject the Italians from Spain. But Italy can come over with their couple of transports, and they've got a couple fighters and the fighter and the tactical on the fleet carrier. So it might be more of a battle than it looks right now. The Italians actually might go on the offensive, take their 3 artillery in Madrid and their 1 infantry, along with their air force and the 2 transports loaded with 4 infantry, and they might actually attack those U.S. units on their portion of the turn before the U.S. can build up anymore. But the Mediterranean continues to be free of any Allied ships. Not much else happening in Africa. There was no attacks. The Free French did get some more Lend-Lease from the United States. So they're up to 4 infantry in Cameroon. But the Japanese are right outside at the Belgian Congo with 2 fighters and infantry and a cavalry. And then they have a fighter that's coming that can make it on this next turn as well. So it looks like the Japanese will attack Cameroon with 3 fighters and infantry and a cavalry this next turn and probably win that battle. So that'll finish off the Free French, and the French will have lost their capital for the second time in the game. That's about it in Europe. Over in the Pacific, things are looking, really bare actually for pretty much every participant here in the Pacific. Each nation has kind of exhausted themselves with attacks and defense. There's not a whole lot left on this side of the board at all. Starting with the Japanese. So as you can see in Asia, there's no more planes. So they risked their entire air force on their portion of the turn. And they had went ahead, they took Korea back from the Russians, moved up into Western Manchuria, took that back from the Russians. And they also finished off the CCP units that were in Burma. But the CCP and the Russians both rolled really well, and it sacrificed the entire Japanese Air Force, which I think was around 3 tacticals and 3 or 4 fighters. So there is nothing left in Asia that's Japanese except for 5 infantry units. Japan does have a bunch of money, so they can obviously put some units down here in Asia. But Japan is definitely not in any position to resume the offensive in Asia. The good news is they've completely ejected the Russians from the Far East, and even the CCP has been kind of whittled down. Now, the CCP do have units up here in northern China. That's 3 artillery, 3 cavalry, and 4 infantry, so they'll easily be able to take Rihe and take that factory off Japan. But other than that, down in Southeast Asia, the CCP's left with just a couple of fighters. They will take Hong Kong with these infantry that are here in Kwangtung, but none of their units can move more than one space besides the aircraft, which can't take our territories. So Japan won't lose much in the way of territory this next turn, and then they will start beefing up the defenses in Asia. Japan also had dropped down a light carrier and 3 destroyers on their portion of the turn, and they also bought 3 transports because what they wanted to do was start getting some of these infantry in Tokyo loaded up on these transports and brought over to the Asian mainland. So Japan will be able to drop 6 infantry off. They can land anywhere here on the coast that's undefended. So Japan does have some options in Asia. As far as Anzac goes, they dropped down a sub and a destroyer. So now outside of Australia, they have 3 destroyers, a light cruiser, 2 transports, and a sub. So now they are, on this turn, going to start taking back some of these money islands. Japan has nothing down here except for a couple of subs that are convoying. Those aren't going to stop the Australians. So Anzac will start being able to take some of these territories back here in Southeast, or in the Money Islands, and in the South Pacific. As far as the U.S. goes, they again spent their entire build in the Pacific. They dropped down 2 fighters and 3 destroyers, and then on the build chart, they dropped down a bunch of ships. So they dropped down 2 fleet carriers and 3 battleships, and then 3 more, and then 3 light cruisers and heavy cruisers. And with their improved construction, they can pay the extra finish off all of these ships here on the next turn. And the U.S. thinking there is that Europe is pretty much lost to the Allies, even with the U.S. Devoting their entire economic resources in Europe. It's not going to really make a dent with what Germany is producing each turn. Whereas in the Pacific, there's more of a chance of the U.S. making a difference. Japan is fairly weak. They really have no navy to speak of. So as soon as the U.S. finish off all these ships on the build chart, they will have more than enough of a navy to deal with whatever Japan has on the board, and we'll get the victory point for having more capital ships in the Pacific. So the U.S. at this point in the game is going more for Japanese strategy, trying to take as many victory points away from the Axis and the Pacific theater as they can. So to that end, they went ahead and they had 3 tacticals and 2 fighters in this southern Japanese home island, along with the 5 infantry and the 5 medium armor. Now, they weren't going to go into Tokyo because that's a stack of nearly 15 infantry, and they also had a fighter. Plus, Japan defends higher in their home territories, so there was no way the U.S. was going to be able to take out Tokyo. So instead, what they try to do is launch their entire air force against the Japanese ships. And the main reason was because they wanted to get those 3 transports off the board so that would strand all the Japanese infantry in Tokyo, and the Japanese wouldn't be able to use those forces to land in China. And this time, the Japanese actually rolled pretty well, and they took out all 5 U.S. planes, and in return lost the 3 destroyers and one of the light carriers. So didn't go the U.S.'s way. If they could have taken out those transports, that would have been huge. The other option obviously would have been just to sit here, but Japan, having 2 major factories in Tokyo, obviously can put units down and just crush what's here, the U.S. forces here in the southern Japanese island anyways. So there was no sense in just sitting back. And the men and the armor stuck there. There's no transports to move them off. They could have taken the planes, maybe landed them somewhere in China to, help out the CCP, but they were in essence trying to help out the CCP by taking out those transports. And the U.S. planes, they could have, tried to pick off some of these territories that have a lone Japanese infantry in them, but they wouldn't have been able to secure the territories. The planes wouldn't have. And if the Japanese got lucky and hit, you'd be sacrificing a plane for a man. So there weren't a lot of options for the U.S. I thought the best thing was trying to take out those transports. It just didn't go the U.S.'s way. So that's the way things look. We're going to be heading into turn 19 here pretty soon. As far as economically goes, Germany again's up to $99 minus bonuses. Japan 48. Italy's even collecting $22. The U.S. is still in the mid 60s, around 64. But the British and the Russians are barely in the teens, as well as the CCP. So the only hope right now is the game lasts a little bit longer and the Allies can make some moves here in the Pacific. Again, Anzac is going to be coming up here on this turn, and with the 2 transports, they can take a couple of these islands back per turn. So now forcing Japan to build up a little bit of a navy to come down and take them out. And then, again, the U.S. is dropping a bunch of ships here off of San Francisco this next turn. So I'm definitely going to be putting the squeeze back on Japan. Not so much that Tokyo will be in danger, but just that the Allies should be able to make some headway and take off some of the victory points from the Allies, at least in the Pacific, heading here into turn number 19.